Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 8, Rabbit. Rabbit. Serpendis awoke to a drop of water landing on his face, falling from a small sapling leaf hanging from the fallen tree under which he laid. A fine mist enveloped their camp, while a gentle drizzle filtered down from the looming branches of the forest above. It was early morning, the sun not yet risen, and everything had a grey, diluted, monochromatic quality as the night slowly receded into shadows. Sounds of birds, insects, and little creatures bounded all around the camp, impossible to approximate their direction or distance. Hero perched on a branch directly above the camp, already eating his first breakfast. Serpendis sat up, but Piecora placed a hand on his shoulder. "Karui explained something to me this morning. This is Kiahalla at its most relatable to its twin aspect in the primal world, as if both aspects of the forest combine for a short while just after dawn to merge into a single identity. This is when the veil is weakest, almost diminished entirely, and so it is most treacherous during these quiet early mornings. Extra caution is required with movements of any kind. The slightest turn or abrupt motion could find someone surrounded by mist, thick and impenetrable, and then they are gone, whisked away to some other time and place. Move slowly." Serpendis did as he was told, rising slowly and leaning his back against the fallen tree behind him. Karui was tending to the remains of the campfire, taking the stones and placing them back in her pack, along with several pieces of kindling, roots, and weeds. She moved in one slow, single motion, and Serpendis could see the mist trailing from her limbs, leaving little eddies and vortices in her wake. Never could he have imagined such a danger as this. "When is it safe to leave and move again?" he asked. "When the mist clears," Piecora answered. "What if something attacks us?" Serpendis asked, feeling exposed. "We hope that never happens. We rely on Karui to keep us safe and hidden while we are vulnerable. If somehow that fails, then we must defend ourselves and see what befalls." Looking up, Serpendis asked, "What about Hero? Is he not affected by the forest?" Piecora paused a few moments before answering. "Karui and I have talked about this, and we aren't certain, except it seems to us that the forest has accepted Hero as its own. It thinks Hero belongs here, or it does not see Hero as an intruder. If such is the case, then it is not aware of the nature of our relationship, how we share the same soul. Thus, I don't think I'm given the same allowance as Hero. I must be as careful as the rest of us." Serpendis then had another thought. "The cat, or lion, that appeared last night. You say it is Karui's animal spirit? Is it the same as with you and Hero?" "No, it is entirely different. The Banwa follow the animals of the steppes of Undying Lands, and they have kinship with the spirits of these animals. The spirits are ambassadors of the animals. Karui's Siru is the panther spirit, representing all panthers. It can be in many places at once, helping all who request its presence. If it falls in battle, it does not die." She paused a moment to think. Each animal in the world has a collective spirit that may be called on, and somewhere in the world this spirit has those who engage with it, Banwa or otherwise. Do Canonians have something like this? Serpendis, now better understanding the nature of the Banwa and their relationship with these animal spirits, thought about any kind of similarity with the people of his home. "No, I don't believe there is anything like that in our society. We simply follow our gods and attribute many of the misgivings that occur in our daily lives to those gods. They are people just like us. For the most part, they bicker and quarrel, cheat and steal, love and destroy, and they have their moods. They are just like us, but they control everything, or so many like to believe. Who's to say that they are merely aspects of our own imagination? that we created them out of our own need to deal with our everyday lives, that we imagined them into existence and now we are slaves to them? 7 of these gods for the 7 cities, and one god as the messenger thief, Nuntifur, also called Hermes, who many merchants like me follow. Serpentis thought more about Piecora and her relationship with Hero, and something nagged at him. Tell me, in your case, you met this hawk in the wild while trying to track down Karui when she didn't return from her pilgrimage, and you say that the 2 of you bonded as if discovering yourself, that your souls were made whole when before you didn't know what was missing. You are saying you had only half a soul? That all Sienians are like this? How did this come about? How is it even true? And why? Why are they so against finding any answers? Piecora took a long moment before replying. Serpentis realized with some discomfort that the forest had become eerily quiet. I am not sure how to answer that. It is what weighs on my mind every day now, since Hero and I found each other. I cannot find any answers for it. I know this discovery was only possible thanks to the Banwa, like so many other things. We owe so much to them, we derived our totem beliefs from them, 6 specific animal spirits that we follow as your gods. They taught us the ways of silage and ink marking, and for only a few of us over the long years of our history, those who broke the rules for whatever reasons, some for love, some for the bond of friendship, they left Sienya to accompany a Banwa on their pilgrimage. They found their soul bond in this way, and this is how we discovered that we are not whole, and only by finding our soul bond do we suddenly have the clarity of someone who is complete. So for you, it was Hero, a raptor. For others, it could be, he began. It could be a fox or buffalo or a snake, she interrupted again, or anything really, as long as it claims our lands as its lands as well. She shrugged her shoulders. He continued, slightly rankled. Perhaps there is a connection there, then, a connection with the land. They say primitive people. Piecora shot Serpentis a sudden glare, and he immediately regretted what he just said. I mean, I am sorry. The word just fell out. It is who I was, not who— Piecora angrily rose into a rigid standing position and began to march away, but Karui fluidly snapped her hand upward and barked a command that halted Piecora in her tracks. The mist had grown thick around the camp, threatening to engulf them, and Serpentis could only make out the general shapes of the nearest trees. There were no sounds whatsoever, and the silence was like a vacuum on Serpentis's ears, causing them to pop randomly on both sides. Serpentis felt a watchfulness from the mist so palpable and yet so elusive that he couldn't help himself but turn around from left to right, whirling his head to spot the interloper who seemed always on the periphery of his vision. Karui hissed at him to slow his movements down. "Steady yourself. They wait for us in the mist," she said. "Sluach, angry spirits from this world and beyond, brought together in the mist of Kiahalla. They cannot pass my protection, but do not get close to the edge. They may reach over and take your soul. They are lured by your heat and your essence." Flying in from the bank of the mist came Hero, disappearing into the opposite side across their camp at such a high speed that it was as if Serpentis blinked him into being. A split moment later, small grey birds erupted over their camp in the eaves above, all flying as one in a single mesmerizing murmuration. Hero zoomed upward out of the mist and briefly split the amorphous shape of the birds only for them to congeal back together behind him. Hero flipped and dove into the mist, reappearing in their camp from another direction and plunging into the mist on the other side. Serpentis heard an eerie buzzing sound when Hero passed by as air collapsed in his wake. Streams of the mist trailed behind Hero as he flew across their campsite, and misty vortices formed beneath his wings as he emerged from one side and plunged into the other, slowly breaking up the wall that was forming around them and scattering the surrounding ghosts. The grey birds overhead continued murmurating over the camp, while Hero chased them between passes. Serpendis cowered and covered his head with his arms as Hero came dangerously close a few times, and Piecora leaned back against the fallen tree, breathing hard while her head was on a swivel while seeing through Hero's eyes. Karui stayed where she was, knees bent and hands ready, looking fearful and confused by Hero's sudden antics. The surrounding mist intensified until Hero began screeching during his passes over the camp and through the mist, his high-pitched cry cleaving the silence like tearing great sheets of linen, panning from one side to the other. Echoes layered on previous echoes until Hero sounded like a dozen versions of himself, shattering the morning's anxious calm, until finally the invading mist came unmoored from the wet ground, and slowly rose above the camp like a spectral ring of white ether. The horde of grey birds above them separated and dissipated with the mist, each one breaking off and flying on its own trajectory until it was lost from view in the forest. As Serpendis watched the mist float and break up above them, the first rays of the sun appeared horizontally between the trunks of the trees like curtains of light, dispelling the ring of mist and all of its vestiges from the morning. The three watched the phantasmal display of sunlight unfold for several moments, unspeaking, while Hero finally came to rest on a lower branch near their camp, breathing heavily and heart-pounding. The grey birds were gone, and the mist dissolved. Finally, moving normally and naturally, Karui stepped over the tracing in the ground surrounding their camp and smudged a section of it away with her foot, breaking the silence by saying, "Ipoltupaya namche vat patu kapanatu." "She says it is safe to travel now," Piecora said. "I know, I understood this time," replied Serpendis. "Does anyone know my favorite meal?" Piecora asked slowly through the side of her mouth. She was aiming an arrow at the distant silhouette of a rabbit sitting on a tree stump, her bow pulled all the way back and the string taut with tension. Serpendis watched behind her, barely able to see her target between hanging vines, arching roots, low-hanging boughs, and thick, twisting trunks of ancient trees. He judged the distance as roughly 100 meters from where he stood, but so much of the forest was in the way. He couldn't imagine how her arrow could strike true. "Oh, let me guess," he answered quietly. He looked up and saw Hero flitting between branches overhead, going back and forth between them and the target. Suddenly, he wondered if the connection between Hero and Piecora gave her an advantage, a combined map of the terrain between them and the target that far exceeded his own understanding based on his limited point of view. She let go of the string, and he heard the boughs deep hum as the arrow flew from her grasp in the blink of an eye. At the same time, Hero launched and dove at the rabbit, and a moment later the rabbit fell over with Hero swooping over it, expressing a loud shriek as he quickly turned and flew back to them, deftly angling between branches and vines. "Ebiende, rabbit," she said to him, smiling. Then she took off jogging toward the kill. "If we should die in this forest, it won't be from starving," she called in mid-stride. Serpendis watched after her, then at Hero as he banked hard left again and soared into the upper branches of the trees, keeping pace with Piecora. Karui, who was further ahead, watched on, waiting for Piecora to gather the kill before continuing to lead the hike. It was just after midday, approaching early afternoon. The sun had not yet reached its zenith in the sky. Warmth permeated the forest. The air on the floor level was still and filled with tiny motes of dust and pollen, despite a breeze that moved the canopy above. Serpendis began walking forward in his usual pace when Karui suddenly shouted, "Wait!" Looking up, he saw that Karui had hopped onto a large root, and her arms and hands were pointed in the direction of the killed rabbit. She whistled, and leaping out of the air behind her came Siru, bounding quickly in the direction her arms were pointing. At the same time, he heard a loud commotion coming from the stump and the slain rabbit. He saw movement all around the stump, leaves and vines and saplings moving violently. Piecora then fell as if her legs were pulled out from under her. Her arms flailed upward, and her bow went flying into the forest on her right side, hitting a large, gnarled trunk and left dangling from a short branch. Her body made a soft thud in the underbrush before being dragged violently toward the stump with the dead rabbit. Breaking into a run, he couldn't understand what he was seeing or what was happening. He heard Hero screeching. He watched as Hero descended onto the stump, ripping his claws into it. Siru was also there, pouncing on the stump and tearing at it with claws and teeth. What in the entire world is happening? He thought to himself, bewildered, as he ran down the same path that Piecora's limp body made while being dragged. As he came closer to the action, he finally saw it. A huge mouth had opened in the side of the stump, and inside were dozens of rows of jagged teeth, like splintered wood. The stump itself was fleshy, despite looking exactly like hard bark, bending this way and that against Siru's attacks. Chunks of it flew in the air from both Hero and Siru, and a thick, dark fluid spattered against the surrounding foliage. The thing made a sound from its mouth like a loud, deep, hollow grumble that extended into a low, vacuous howl. He heard what sounded like bending and twisting and cracking tree membranes as the thing, constructed of tough, grizzled muscle, worked against Hero and Siru. The forest floor surrounding the stump exploded in violent upheaval from large, whipping limbs with the same coloration and textures as the forest's vines. One such tentacle was looped tightly around Piecora's constricted legs, and to Serpendis's horror, she was being dragged right into the thing's huge, toothy mouth. He realized Piecora was not putting up any fight. Her arms and body were limp, and her eyes were closed. Without thinking, he raced forward and grabbed her hatchet slung on her belt. He fumbled with the clasp as her feet entered the creature's mouth, and when he finally released the hatchet, her legs were already inside. He lunged forward and hacked at the constricting limb around her legs. Being this close now to the creature, he smelled something strange, like overripe lemons, wood pulp, and bile. Piecora's leather breeches, torn here and there exposing parts of her legs, were covered in a translucent slime exuded from the coiled appendages. The acrid smell from the creature's ooze overpowered Serpendis, and he fought to keep himself steady and awake. The hatchet's blade cut into the appendage like striking a wet melon. Meat, gel, and ichor flew in the air with each swing. He swung down several more times until he cleaved the serpentine growth in half, spilling dark sap everywhere. Karui grabbed Piecora beneath the arms and pulled as more of the creature's appendages whipped along the ground, trying to recapture its food. Serpendis stood his ground, flailing at the coils around him with Piecora's hatchet, each strike sending pieces of flesh and thick sap in all directions. He became soaked in the creature's hot sustenance, his face covered and his weathered robe saturated and clinging to his wet legs. Another whipping vine found purchase on Piecora's ankle and yanked her leg into its mouth, lurching Karui forward. It snapped its jaws shut on Piecora's leg, but she did not utter a sound or react in any way, Serpendis surged with panic-induced adrenaline. Bracing himself right inside the jaws, his back bent against the upper jaw, and several splintered teeth sinking into his shoulder, he poured all his strength into his legs, forcing the mouth to open while hacking at the assailing vines with Piecora's hatchet. The appendage around Piecora's ankle split open, one end still attached to her foot, and Karui pulled again with all her might, dragging Piecora away from the creature and on top of herself. Serpendis suddenly felt the thing moving, and for some reason, after everything that just happened, this unnerved him the most. By the gods, it moves, he thought. He felt it suddenly lurching awkwardly away from him and his companions, as if uprooting itself. The few jagged teeth in his shoulder broke off from its mouth, and Serpendis slipped out with the teeth still embedded in him. On top of the thing, he saw Siru annihilating its fleshy carapace, the rabbit-shaped bait wagging in the air like a flimsy stuffed animal on a thin stalk. Hero continued attacking it with his talons, ripping whole chunks of it into the air with each pass. Serpendis realized it was trying to get away. He became furious with uncontrolled rage. Dropping the hatchet, he pushed with both hands against it, while planting his feet into the roiling forest floor. He opened his mouth, let out a guttural cry, and lifted the thing up until it toppled over backwards, revealing its underside, which almost made Serpendis retch with revulsion. Hundreds of soft, pale, writhing appendages comprised its entire underbelly and appeared to be its mode of locomotion. Serpendis was hit by hot air and a nasty pulp smell that sent his mind swimming. The thing howled loudly again as it rolled backward, Siru tumbling with it. Serpendis heard from behind him a shout from Karui, and suddenly the forest floor behind the creature erupted in fungal mycelia and enveloped the creature in a pulsating web, pulling it further from them and toward two saplings waving in the tumult. A pale, veiny appendage lashed out and coiled around Serpendis's torso and pulled hard. His head swam as the coil's slime soaked through his robe and contacted his skin, but he shook his head to fight off the sudden drowsiness. He quickly snatched up the hatchet and swiped at the new, younger, more supple appendage squeezing his ribs. He saw the main body of the struggling creature gradually fade from existence as it slowly passed between the two saplings. Realizing that Karui was intentionally dragging it between the two young trees, passing it through an unseen threshold to some unknown destination outside of this current reality, he feared he'd be dragged along with it. Serpendis hooked his left leg around one sapling and planted his slippered foot against the horrific beast while hacking at the coils, reaching for him. Karui continued pulling it through to the other side with her command over the forest's mycelial network. He saw his foot begin to fade as the creature slowly passed from their reality. He lost all feeling in it, and intense cold raced up his leg like submerging it in ice. "By Kananaya's breath, you chose the wrong day to be alive, fiend," screamed Serpendis, and the limb that coiled around his ribs suddenly snapped from one final hack from Piecora's hatchet, sending the creature flailing beyond the crossing and disappearing from their world altogether. Serpendis flew backwards, landing roughly in the muddy undergrowth where the main fight commenced. He fought to calm his laborious breathing as his head swam like being intoxicated on Ennegraden wine. Dull pain coursed through his ribs with each breath, and sharp pangs of hot, searing pain throbbed in his shoulder. Karui was on him before he could gather his thoughts, checking him over and pulling out the thing's teeth from his shoulder until he finally nodded and waved her off. She said in Banwarise, "I need to find clean water. Stay with her while I go with Hero. I leave Siru with you." As if to punctuate her statement, Siru emerged from the air behind her and sat beside him. He recalled seeing Siru leave their realm of reality while still attached to the creature, but then he remembered that Siru can be anywhere and everywhere for those who call upon him. Apparently, each summoned apparition of Siru was a temporal manifestation of a far greater being, existing outside time and space, and he wondered if these animal spirits were, in fact, gods. He looked back at Piecora, who laid flat on her back, her arms over her head, unmoving and unconscious. Her legs were crushed together awkwardly and bleeding from several wounds visible through her torn breeches. "Is she alive?" he asked Karui in Banwarese. He noted that this was perhaps the first time he spoke the Banwa language, and he did so without barely thinking about it. "Yes, but she is in deep sleep. A symptom of the slime excreted by the creature's coils. It is probably for the best right now, as she cannot feel the pain she would otherwise be in. Her legs are crushed, and she cannot walk. Do not move her until I get back." She must have seen the empathic concern flood Serpendis's face, for she continued while placing a hand on his face, "Have hope. This was a good outcome. It could have been so much worse. And she is still with us through Hiero." She pointed up, and he saw Hiero perched on a branch behind Karui. "Wait for us. Do not move her until I get back." She then rose and jogged off, and Serpendis could hear her shouting to Hiero, her voice echoing from the trees. "Come, find us clean, clear water, not stagnant, swift-moving water. Be quick." Serpendis pulled himself up and moved over to Piecora. Her eyes were closed, but he could see them moving this way and that beneath her eyelids. Was she really sleeping, or was she inhabiting Hiero, like Karui implied? Again, he was struck by her uncanny relationship with Hiero and wondered if she could be as one with the raptor, even when her body was broken. What if she died, or Hiero? Would their souls come together within the same vessel? Or would the other half suffer the rest of its life a half-soul, as they did before their souls were joined? He tore pieces of his robe and wrapped the fabric over the open wounds on her legs, cautious not to move them. He was conscientiously aware of his own wounds in his shoulder and knew that without his renewed vitality, he would certainly be dead by now. Drenched in the creature's dark, syrupy blood, his wounded side was also soaked with his own. All around them lay the remains of the fight. Broken coils of the creature's limbs were strewn about the muddy surroundings. After retrieving her bow and placing her hatchet next to her, he walked around, surveying the carnage while keeping an eye on Piecora. His inspection led him to the place where it was initially rooted into the earth. It was a circular hole that looked like the footprint of a large tree that had been uprooted. Looking into the hole, he discovered the remains of undigested equipment and materials. The pile consisted of rusted pieces of armor and broken weapons, splintered sword blades and axes, links of chainmail rusted and fused together, and dented pauldrons and greaves, and a metal breastplate bent and contorted with an open crack down the middle, its edges pointed outward. Serpendis pictured in his mind the gruesome sight of coils wrapped around the breastplate and crushing its victim trapped inside the armor until it split outward down the middle. Lifting the damaged breastplate from the hole, he found the Alagostan star engraved on its front. Alagost, the palace kingdom of Canania, he thought with despair. How did this poor sot get trapped here? He sifted through the pile at the bottom of the hole, trying to find anything useful. Long forgotten and buried deep in his psyche were the ambitions of treasure that drove him earlier. He was alone in this treacherous forest. His guide and friend lay unconscious on the ground, and he had no idea when the Banwa maiden would return. Lying on his stomach and reaching down, he plucked a silver-like coin, its edges worn and corroded, from the bottom of the hole. He rubbed it a moment, removing as much dirt and filth as he could. Then he licked it. He tasted the familiar tang of platinum on the tip of his tongue. He didn't own any himself, but he handled such wealth only a few times in his life when dealing with dignitaries and nobles. A single coin could fetch a nice house in Coast Haven. Flipping it around and studying it, he found a large tree engraving on one side and a ring of trees on the other, with a single, elegant rune of many curves and dots in perfect concert with each other. It reminded him of a highly decorative musical note. He then saw others at the bottom of the hole, and one by one he delicately lifted each coin until he had about a dozen total in various states of decay. He wiped each coin with a corner of his torn robes and pocketed them, only briefly thinking of their enormous worth back home. None of that mattered here right now. He kept going through the pile until he found an ornate leather belt with what seemed at first a knife sheath, but instead of being flat for a blade, it was rounded, like a thin, narrow cone that came to a point at the bottom. A long, leather-wrapped handle stood out from the leather sleeve's opening, and the back of the handle was exposed, polished bone, shaped irregularly with points and extensions, as if it were recently plucked from some skeletal insertion point. Serpendis realized that the pommel was a continuation of the grip itself, narrow, long, and irregular, wrapped in leather. Was this knife handle made from human bone? A femur? Too small for that. Perhaps the ulna, or radius, he thought, reaching back to his academic days in Dolgithad. He dragged the belt and knife from the hole, letting bits of cloth, scraps of metal, and chain links fall. He found that the leather belt was in decent condition, despite some weathering here and there, and the clasps and rivets were ornately crafted from someone who was clearly a master leathersmith. Unclasping and withdrawing the strange, pointed weapon revealed more bone, long, slightly curved, and sharpened to a vicious point. The base of the bone's exposed weapon part was a dark umber color, where it became the handle wrapped in leather, but the color gradated into ivory coloring until becoming white and clear at the point's very tip. Very fine, dark veins ran up the sharpened bone from the leather wrapping, giving the weapon a beautiful marbleized quality that became translucent near the point of the tip. Serpendis had never seen such polish on bone before, and marveled at what dark methods in alchemy could have been used to treat the bone. He flicked it with his finger and even tried testing its breaking point with both hands, only to find how strong and resilient the weapon was. What in the world could this be, he thought, holding the weapon close to his face? Who was your owner to befall such a fate? He then buckled the belt around his torso, outside of his robe, and sheathed the knife. It slid into its holster perfectly and seamlessly. After investigating the hole a little more, he came around and sat by Piecora's head, lifted it gently and laid it on his leg as he leaned back against a mid-sized tree. He adjusted himself and her upper body so that she half laid in his lap, trying to make her as comfortable as possible while not stabbing himself with her antlers. Looking down, he wiped tendrils of black hair from her face, then decided to remove her antler headpiece. "This will not be of use to you now," he muttered, while working at the wrappings woven beneath her braids, loosening the antlers. "Not in your current state, anyway. Gods, you wear this thing tightly. It's as if it's a weapon. One that I might impale myself on if I'm not careful," he said, while finally removing the antlers from beneath her braids and setting the headpiece on the ground. "Must be a weapon, a Siennian weapon. I wonder how you use such a thing in a fight." He then laid his head back, closed his eyes, and gently patted her shoulder. "We're in it now, aren't we? We are really in it now, the Siennian guide and the Canonian scholar, and we have no idea where we are. I hope your friend returns soon." In answer, Piecora's eyes continued shifting about beneath her eyelids, seeing things far away from their current position. Serpendis awoke with a start, looking around and blinking in confusion. His shoulder throbbed with intense pain, and he had difficulty lifting his arm. He couldn't remember falling asleep. Looking down, he saw Piecora resting on his numb leg, her eyes continuing to move behind their lids, while the rest of her body lay in the dirt, her broken legs clumsily bandaged here and there with pieces of his robe. It all came flooding back to him. The fight with the strange creature that baited them near its range of attack, using a form of mimicry he had never witnessed before. That creature would leave an imprint of horror in his mind that would later invade his dreams from time to time, pretending to be something innocuous, only to lash out in writhing limbs, crushing everything within its reach. He shifted around and frantically tried to collect his thoughts. Time, he thought. Where is the sun? Where is Karui? The sun was no longer in the sky. The trees were casting long, horizontal shadows, and it was getting cold on the forest floor, where he and Piecora sat, both badly wounded from the fight. She hasn't returned, he thought deliriously, shivering from the cold. Gods! We won't survive the night! He got up as quickly as he could, while gently laying Piecora's head back down onto the dirt. He paced wide circles around the muddy battlefield, kicking at pieces of flesh and chunks of limbs from the horrible beast that ambushed them. Gods, gods, he yelled loudly while buckling over, his fists over his ears. He was furious and terrified all at once. All this time until now, he relied on others to get him through each day. But now he was alone, and this time really alone. Where is she, he thought. His mind was quickly approaching a level of panic he had never experienced before, not even during the Banwar attack, and he knew it. He strode back and forth like a madman, muttering to himself. I had my wits back then, he mumbled. That's what pulled me through. That's how I survived. Instinct and vision and all that. I had my own inner strength born from intelligence, self-importance, from ignorance. I was a fool. No, I could at least think back then. I had my mind. My mind was my own. But now, I cannot even think at all. What do I do? What do I do? He wailed, throwing himself in random directions, pressing his fists against the sides of his head, his one shoulder stiff and in constant agony, soaking from renewed bleeding. He suddenly stopped and looked over at the broken body of Piecora. What would she do? He asked quietly. He hurried over to her, flung himself on his hands and knees, and stared closely at her face. What would you do? He whispered helplessly, affectionately wiping away dirt and grass from her face, as if she were his child. Fighting back tears, he asked again, What would you do, girl? Tell me. What would you have me do? But her face, smeared with blood and silagen ink, was unresponsive except for her eyes in constant movement beneath their lids. Your eyes. What are you seeing? He said, slowly rising up and calculating a conclusion. Hero. You're seeing through Hero, which means he's still alive. So I assume Karui is still alive, and so are you. Somehow, this calmed him a little, knowing that perhaps he wasn't completely alone. He sat up and let his hands fall to his sides while surveying his surroundings. Gods, it'll be dark in an hour, he said to her. His eyes roamed over the hole left over from the beast and then lingered there. I must move quickly. He hopped up and ran over to the hole, bent down and began heaving the old pieces of armor and equipment out of the hole. He held onto several axe handles and gathered some rope, then ran back over to Piecora. Quickly, he laid the axe handles along her legs and then carefully wrapped them together with the rope. Each movement of her legs made it evident that her bones were crushed in many places, and he feared she would never walk again. He strained against his emotions, fighting to keep from sobbing uncontrollably as he worked at stabilizing her lifeless legs, as futile as it all seemed to him. He wasn't even sure why he was doing this, except that it felt like something he should do before advancing to the next step of his plan. Karui said to not move her, but if they were to survive the night, he was going to have to move her, and maybe not delicately, so he might as well mitigate as much damage as possible. At least that's how his brain formulated his decisions. When he was satisfied with splinting her legs together, he raced back over to the hole and pulled more equipment out. He laid out several broken shields and stretched fabric and leather over them, lashing everything together with more rope found in the hole like a hastily assembled raft. He laid sword blades and poles and axes crisscrossed over his creation, then frantically pulled up roots and vines and leaves, attaching them to the top side of the raft and covering it with grass and sticks. His head swam from hunger, blood loss, and the constant throbbing pain in his shoulder that was advancing down his arm and into his back and chest. It still hurt when he breathed from when the thing had him around the ribs, but now he felt the burning from his shoulder wound encroaching on his breathing. He could barely see in the failing light. Sweat ran in his eyes, but all the while a thought was building in his mind like a rising monolith. I'll not let the forest take us tonight. I will not allow it. Not tonight. He was pulling a knot in the rope tight with his teeth when a nearby roar shook the trees into dead silence, sending shivers over his bones. Looking up with terror-induced clarity, he realized that night had deceptively descended on them, and he could barely see anything. He held himself completely motionless, hearing only the sound of his breaths and the pounding of his pulse in his ears. Then something large contacted the ground somewhere nearby, sending tremors beneath his feet. There was another sound, like something rubbing against a tree and ripping pieces of bark away in its grip. Then another loud thump, shaking the ground, and another scrape against a tree. His body burst into action before he was even aware of it. He raced over to Piecora, sliding next to her, hooked his hands beneath her arms, and dragged her towards the hole as fast as his legs could carry them both. His shoulder burned in tortured pain, and his ribs ached from the sudden exertion. He had no idea where he was going with Piecora until he fell backwards into the hole with her, landing on top of him with all of her weight. Reaching up, straining against her body and the pain in his shoulder, he grabbed the makeshift lid, disguised as best as he could within the allotted time as part of the forest floor, and pulled it over them just as he saw the thing appear. Its dark shape stood in an area lit by starlight, only slightly brighter than the shades of the surrounding forest. It was at least over a story tall, with a gigantic head that swiveled almost all the way around on a wide, muscular neck, connected to an enormous hulking trunk of a torso. Its single massive arm was out to the side, and its hand gripped the trunk of a tree. Its single leg had just landed again onto the forest floor, bringing it out into the open. It then braced its leg as if preparing to jump and lunged forward, landing hard right where he and Piecora rested earlier that afternoon. The silhouette of the creature made no sense to Serpendis, nor did its mechanics. Although it only had one arm and one leg, it did not seem to be missing their counterparts. It wasn't as if another arm or another leg had been cut off, and it was simply making do with what it had. No, the creature's body was intentionally designed and well-balanced on one massive leg. Its muscular, singular arm could twist all around its bulky torso, and its neck could swivel around so its head could see in all directions. Despite this awkward configuration, it moved with horrifying grace and agility. Without any trees to hold onto, it stood there balancing on its one leg, slowly twisting its torso all the way around, sniffing the night air. Serpendis realized in horror that it seemed to fear absolutely nothing as it stood there in the starlight. It did not sneak or crawl or constantly look around for threats. In fact, it didn't even look bothered at all. Its movements were slow and purposeful, and it seemed alert, yet relaxed. It knew that anything in the forest aware of its position would cower from it. The monstrosity swung its head around, and Serpendis caught a brief, momentary glimpse of its face in the darkness. A large single eye, visible only by the glint of starlight on its glassy surface, swept over their hiding spot. In that split moment, Serpendis made arbitrary eye contact. He winced, felt his lungs collapse and expel all their air, and he crumpled into a fetal position in the hole, embracing Piecora's body while shaking uncontrollably, his muscles seizing and his heart pounding against his chest. His breathing came in short, rapid wheezes that matched his elevated heart rate. He didn't know if his eyes were open or closed or even aligned at all. Never before had he felt such physical, catatonic fear as he did when he glimpsed the thing's gigantic eye, highlighted by starlight. It hit him with soul-crushing force, and he lost control of all bodily functions. While in the throes of his seizure, he barely registered the thing loudly grunting and snorting the air, and then passing over them with 3 heavy footfalls, each one more distant than the last. Thud, 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 and then it was gone. Serpendis lay next to Piecora, holding her tight, every muscle in his body from his neck to his feet, and his fingers taut and shaking painfully, uncontrollably. Inside, he was an iced-over wasteland, empty and dormant, and he soon faded from consciousness with his soul barely tethered to his body. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.